Hi.
Hi.
Renee, was that you?
Yes, hi, I'm here.
Okay. Diane, are you back? Okay. Anybody else out there I missed? All right. Welcome from the outside to the inside. You'll hear them periodically. Mute your mic, though, if the dog starts barking.
Is there anything in particular that drew you to this talk that I can make sure I address for those of you at home?
Excuse me, I didn't hear that. Sorry.
For those of you that are on the line, is there anything in particular about this talk that I should be focused on to meet your needs?
No, I want to hear everything that you have to say.
And is the connection bad? Do I need to speak slowly and clearly, or can I rattle on in my Boston Roo speed?
It sounds good now. I was actually on the my computer speakers, and it was a bit choppy, but this connection was much better.
All right.
Good. Sounds good.
You sound very clear to me, so thank you.
Thank you.
Click in the middle of it if you want to. There you go.
So, I was totally impressed with what Dr. Feig put together, and I'm very honored to be here. I have a relatively new position, and my boss was informed last week in our one-on-one that I was leaving for the day and that I was going to be speaking to my peers. And he's not a nurse. He's not I don't know what he is, but he's not, it's not an academic appointment, so I have no idea what his credentials are. But this was my way of saying to him within 6 months of being hired that this still matters to me. And I'm a nurse first, a PhD second, and I'm your employee, but I got roots. So that's what I'm here for, and I really do need to revisit those roots. It's been a long haul, and it's only because I'm old that I have this kind of a long haul of information to share with you. It is not to be admired or emulated. It's simply a path. And the path occurred to me partially because what you see on the left-hand side are some images of me as a small child. I'm a bossy person. I'm one of 6. A lot of brothers in there, and I had to be pretty bossy, and I did very well with being that kind of maternal bossy person in my household. I was in the middle. My mother was exhausted, so she let me kind of run the show. And I learned a lot of the kinds of skills that would be traditional skills for a young man in my world. We didn't have a lot of sexism in those days when you were living in the country, in central Pennsylvania, in Appalachia. So that's my childhood. And I didn't realize much that shaped me until I spent a little time thinking about what I did in my career. When I went to the University of Pittsburgh for my undergraduate program, I was so excited to be in a city that I was more interested in being a student than I was in being a nurse particularly. It was important to be in the university, but it was a very big experience for me. And Pitt was a watershed moment because I realized that I really, really, really cared about being a nurse as part of that undergraduate experience. After that undergraduate experience, I did what I was told I should do, and that is a little med-surg and a little OB because I loved it. I don't know if we still tell undergraduate students that they should start out in med-surg, but that's where I started. Hated it, went over to OB as quickly as I could in early NICUs and then into pediatrics. And stayed in that pediatric maternal child right in the middle from childbirth through acute care for the rest of my hands-on career as a nurse, and still find a lot of fondness for that area. After I spent some time at McGee and the med-surg and in the NICU there at Children's of Pittsburgh, what I learned there was that I was fascinated with the technology of surgical procedures, and I spent a lot of time looking inside of children's bodies during surgical procedures. Some of them were remarkable. The neurosurgeons that took me under their wings and allowed me to look in the scopes into brains that had incredible growths and pathology in living children. But more importantly, I learned that those kids that were lined up, this was primitive, but at Pittsburgh at the time, children were lined up in their beds in the hall to go into surgery. They weren't allowed to be with their parents. They were lined up in the hall in their beds, usually in a cage-like structure so they couldn't crawl out. And I spent most of my time with the kids. And that became something that was more important to me because it was a way for me to be connected with patients. The technology was fascinating, but I never lost that need to be connected with people and with patients, and that's a common thread throughout. When I look back, I realize how strong that was. When I left Pittsburgh, I skipped Penn State in here, but that's where it falls. I taught at Penn State briefly, met Dr. Feig and a number of other people, and was inspired to continue teaching. And I hadn't really thought about teaching as a career, but I had a child at the time, and the pragmatist in me said this is a good way to have a life. And I went out to the University of Washington on an impulse. That stubbornness, that adventuresomeness never has left. I still want to do something different. I get restless, and I got restless. So I drove over to Seattle. I taught until I was far enough along in my residency to be able to get in-state tuition. And then I paid my way through school by working part-time at a maternal child nursing setting and did my doctorate. I had a 3-year budget, and I did it in 3 years and finished up that doctorate and then did the dutiful thing and said, okay, what do I do next? I mentioned here underneath the UW the CHDB, which was one of the clinical sites on the university campus, and it still exists because I forgot what the acronym was, but that's a site that was for the School of Ed, and my doctorate is actually out of the Department of Education, not a nursing program at the time. The nursing program was brand new. Nobody knew how long it was going to take, and I didn't have a budget for that kind of ambiguity. I had a budget for 3 years. So that was what I said. I'm going to go to Ed. I'll do something there in psychology, educational psychology. And there's a school on campus for kids with all types of developmental disabilities, from minor, functional, high-functioning kids who are on the spectrum, although that wasn't the phrase then, through severe and profound. And those children were in need of a school nurse, so I played as a school nurse for a little while, and it was probably the first time I totally reinvented myself because I knew nothing about being a school nurse, but I knew a lot about what children needed, and I had great people on staff. There was an audiologist on staff. She'd been itching to have the responsibility to do the hearing screens. Fine with me. You know how to do it. I don't. Let's work together. We had people on staff who had expertise in the legal parameters of child abuse. Fine with me. I can spot a bruise, and we can talk about whether or not we need to do something about it. And I knew how to find the doctors and the parents, and coaching parents with things like how to wash clothes so their children didn't smell bad. I mean, there's a lot of plain, ordinary, basic nursing in that setting that was a thrill for me to do. And I did that part-time as part of my graduate work for my budget. And it left a lasting impression on me, especially with the truly autistic children. When I left there, the things that are in the red box are the times when I reinvented myself. And the commonality in reinventing myself was that I found a path forward so that I could meet that kind of, I'm bored, I got to do something different part of me, which I think is your feeling. And I wanted to try to follow a traditional path. I finished my doctorate. I thought I'd be teaching. There were 5 schools of nursing at that time in Boston when I moved there from Seattle. And in those 5 schools of nursing, I sent letters to introduce myself and ask for an interview, and not one responded to me. Not one. So I went to Children's because there wasn't anything else to do. And I worked at Children's for a number of years and quickly found that all those folks in those academic programs were struggling in part because they were challenged to stay open. One of them closed soon after I got there, BU. And others were smaller and trying to figure out how not to compete and stay open. But I made friends with all of them because when I was at Children's, I was called a nurse researcher, which is another story in and of itself. And they were all looking for that connection with academics to the clinical side, which is what Dr. Feig mentioned. So I ended up spending a fair amount of time with my very small network of colleagues who were also nurse researchers in academic settings, and we were all struggling with trying to define what that means. You know, what is that role? How do we define it? Are there models for us? And there were not. This was the early 80s, the mid-80s. So for the first time, this is a reinvention role because I basically said, okay, this is what I want to do. And I did what I wanted to do within the bounds of what would meet children's needs. And there were 2 areas where children's had, well, there are 3 areas where children's had needs that I was privileged enough to be able to help support. One was the fairly uncommon at the time need for staff nurses to be able to pursue a research question. The thought at the time, and I'm probably blaspheming here, but the thought at the time was that nurses at the bedside could do clinical research. And it's just not realistic. It's just not. Not if they're going to be staff nurses and take care of patients as their first priority. But with support, could they do something interesting? Yes. We did a couple of small exploratory studies that at their time were not my area of expertise, but theirs. That's that other common thread I've learned as I've looked back at my history is this, desire to partner with people, bring my skills as a scientist or my skills as a informaticist or whatever those skills are, partner with somebody who's actually doing the work to produce something useful. I somehow got the impression when I was in nursing school you do it all by yourself. And that's bad. That's bad. You don't. You always have to partner with somebody. And partnering with the staff nurses, they have the research questions. I have the research skills. We didn't do anything grand. It did not lead to a program of research. It wouldn't. But it could start opening the doors and queries about how do you understand this particular problem. And when I looked back at the publications that have come since the few that we did, I realized that we did influence others' publications. The nurses, the one I remember the most that was the most important to me because I felt like it was the most valuable was work with infants with congenital heart disease. Children's has a ton of those kids. One-of-a-kind hearts. They had a book, drawings of one-of-a-kind hearts because that's the kind of kids they got. And they did fascinating work with those children from a plumbing perspective, from a surgical perspective. But the management for the nurses was archaic. The physicians felt that the babies would be too stressed if they ate by breast. It's too hard. And that they always should drink with bottle. And not only should they use a bottle, you should slash the nipple so that they can drink it faster with less stress to their hearts. The staff kept saying to me, especially Ginny Combs, who was the first author on the first paper we did, that's hard on those babies. They need to breastfeed. And Ginny is about this big, about 25 pounds soaking wet. Delightful young woman with this gorgeous southern accent. And Ginny would drawl in her lovely accent. They need to breastfeed. Ginny's one of the first lactation consultants I worked with. She's gone on to be a very powerful, in the local community, member of the lactation consultant community. But Ginny was committed and convinced that breastfeeding was easier for these babies than bottle feeding. So we did a little descriptive study, followed some of the parents afterwards, asked them questions about weight gain, asked them questions about what they were doing to feed, and because it was nurses talking to them, they were honest with us, I believe. More than one mother said to us, well, I don't tell her doctor this, or I didn't tell her surgeon this, but I've breastfed her since I brought her home. And it was delightful. And, the mothers felt that the breastfeeding wasn't so hard. And their weight patterns showed that they were gaining weight comparably to those babies who had actually better than those babies who were bottle fed. So we thought we were onto something, and a couple of years later we had a new lactation consultant who was accredited, a certified lactation consultant, who wanted to look into a little further. So we ended up getting a nice little setup with the folks who did O2 sat monitors. They loaned us a monitor, and we did some monitoring of babies, both breast and bottle feeding, same infants, selfless control, and found that the patterns were amazingly different. The babies who were bottle fed were showing desaturations on a regular basis, and they were showing some variability that was striking. The breastfed kids, just like this, within the saturation range. So I found those when I was going through my old papers, but it was something that was driven by the staff, and it was important to the nurses, and I think has contributed to the literature following what's happened after that, although those were very early exploratory studies. So children's was a place where you create a role, and we had to figure out what a nurse researcher did. Clinical research, one part. Health services research, another part. We wanted to understand medication errors. We wanted to understand what the contributors were to medication errors, and the driver for that was that the clinicians, this was in oncology, realized that they were going to be held to task for medication errors, and they wanted some sort of descriptive work on medication errors. So we did that work as well, trying to figure out how to prevent medication errors in that particular setting and understand what they looked like. So we did a retrospective study of all the orders and the errors that were associated with them for a period of, I forget how many months, it was over 1,000 orders, which in a manual day, without any databases, was a lot of work. But we tried to find patterns and over-identify errors so that we could talk about things that actually got to the kids and things that didn't. And one of the results was some work to templatize the order sets. And another non-published piece of work was to look at the relationship between the physician's experience and the errors that were written. And interestingly enough, the interns, residents were less likely to make errors than the attendings. Too complex. Those orders were incredibly complex, even when they were templatized. The residents were there all the time. The attendings came and went. So while most errors were caught, it was an interesting thing for the docs to think about and to try to figure out how to manage, and that I was not given access to, but that's okay. And the cardiology physicians, the cardiovascular surgeons, were also interested for the same reason, looking at their practice, and we found some of the things you would expect there by looking at one of the physicians would keep daily rounds. He collected data on 50 data points on an 8 by 14 page, 50 data points manually. When we put it in and started to look at patient outcomes, we found what most people had been finding at that point. Those very familiar procedures have very few significant untoward events. Those rare procedures were more likely to have the untoward events. We couldn't go much further than that with that descriptive set, but it was helpful for him to start to think about how you boost up practice, clinician practice, surgeons practice specifically, to make sure that people knew when the event was, when the surgery was an unusual one, they had to be extra special careful while they were learning how to do it right. I was there a long time, and I stayed at Children's a long time because my kids were little and I was focused, and spent enough time there doing health services research and clinical research, and was happy with it. But eventually you get bored. I get bored, and I wanted out. I was talking to somebody on the plane this morning who was saying, you know, when I go to talks like this one, it really helps me if I understand how people shifted. How'd you find a way out? I spent 2 or 3 years at each one of these reinvention periods finding a way out, literally. And I don't think that that was wasted time, because by the time I left Children's, I was in an unusual sort of role, and finding the next path was hard. There is no real clear, what does a nurse researcher do next if academia is not the option? I spent a lot of time trying to get into health services positions where patient outcomes were being studied, and that's what they were called in those days. No luck. Most of those were run by physicians, and they didn't understand anything of value that I could bring, and that's fair. I couldn't articulate it. I spent a lot of time on Monster, and I found a job on Monster with a startup company. And the startup company did electronic data capture during clinical trials. If you're familiar with clinical trials, you know patients typically take home a paper diary, and they complete it daily, sometimes multiple times, during the test of the compound. And those patient diaries are prone to all kinds of errors, as you can imagine. Pick 1 of 5 choices, and they pick between 2 and 3. Or they pick 4 choices. Or they write notes that counter what they wrote, what they selected. They're really garbage in, garbage out, because clinical trials often need that kind of input, especially when you can't measure the effects in any other way but through the patient diary. There was a push in the early 90s, mid-90s, toward collection of patient diaries electronically. This little startup company was doing that, and when I went from Monster, for whatever reason it looked interesting, from Monster to the website, I realized that they had at least one person on staff who I recognize as kinship. He was an MIT PhD in neurophysiology, and somebody I could talk to, and that the company was quite small. And the story is actually funny. I sent my resume in, and at the time they were so small that resumes just shot out of the fax machine and landed on the floor. And when they needed somebody, they'd go through the resumes. And somebody went through the resumes and called me, and she was running the client services group, the people that actually worked with the sponsors and the pharmaceutical companies to make sure that the program on the device met their needs for their trial. Well, Jody called me, did a 20-minute bang, 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 bang interview, and I was like stunned. She goes, you don't work for me, but talk to Steve. Steve was the MIT guy. So I called Steve, made an appointment, went to see him, terrified. You know, every time you make a reinvention, you're afraid that somebody's going to figure out you're a fraud. It isn't just when you come out of your doctoral program. It's constant, every time. But the amazing thing is they don't see you that way, so you just swallow it, forget it. Right. But, you know, I was terrified I was a fraud, and I go in and I meet this man who is the total MIT professor. I mean, most of those guys, God forbid they hear me say this, forget to zip their pants. They're so smart. They're so, so smart that social skills are really low on the set. You know, they're just not important. Steve made an off-color joke about my nationality, about Italian women. I think he was trying to say he thought I was attractive. Totally inappropriate interview. What else did he say? I asked him how many studies they'd actually done, clinical trials. He told me. He was embarrassed. He's on the computer the whole time. He took a phone call in the middle of our session. I left the room knowing he's super intense, not somebody I wanted to work with, and somewhat offensive. Nobody else called me back. So when he called me back, I went.
We make choices.
I found that people really liked him. And it was tiny. I was number 70 employee, which I would highly recommend if you give it a shot at working at a tiny place. It's an awesome experience. I went in the first day of the job and I said, okay, how do I get oriented? Such a nurse. He goes, I don't know. I said, okay, how do I learn what I have to do? He says, just go do it. Okay, bite your tongue. Go out to your desk, try to organize your materials and your stuff. And then he says, I need something. And he tells me what he needs. And I say, tomorrow or next week? He goes, I need it now. I went, okay, this is my new world. Mm-hmm. The pace is different, but the pace is very satisfying to me. I like getting things done and off my desk. The pace hasn't changed. It doesn't change when you're in a corporate world. The idea that somebody can say to you, do this now, drop everything else is there. That happens to me, I'm sure, too, but it happens more often in the corporate world. But what I found was satisfying there was that there was no role. Nobody had a job description for me. And that meant I could, once more, reinvent myself. I could create it. And I started to poke my nose into things that people hadn't really opened the doors for me to do. I spent time with the developers, and I found that that's why there's the developer picture over there. Developers are my people. Engineers are my people. I have so much fun with these guys. I really enjoyed them. And I found that their concern about being asocial is not an issue. I'm probably fairly asocial myself. I don't have really good social skills. But we were on a par because that, I have a skill set, you have a skill set. Where do we fit together? Matters a lot. I remember you saying something when we were at Penn State about finding a common language, and I think about that every time I work with a different group of people. We needed to find a common language, but my skill set was that I understood what was going on in clinical trials. I understood the researchers. I understood the scientists. And while I am not going to say that pharma is not to be criticized, I'm not there at all, I do believe they're really good people at pharma, and I had the luxury of working with a lot of them to find out what they were trying to accomplish and figure out how we could help through an application on a phone. So the developers and I would have conversations. I fell into the role of supporting the salespeople because the sales guys didn't have to talk to the scientists, and the scientists would shred them. They would come in and talk about their technology, and the scientists would say, I don't care about that. I want to know if you can meet this clinical need. And this, our sales guys that were over their heads, they were technology people. They didn't get it. So I filled that gap with them and was able to go out on many, many, many sales calls and had the luxury in the early days of that company to be honest with what the system could do and what it couldn't do. I didn't have a high level of corporate oversight that prevented me from being honest about what it could and could not do. When that high level of oversight came, I left because it was no longer somewhere, a place where I felt like I could make a full contribution. But in that course of that time, I would find unmet needs, and our product was small and young. I would find unmet needs that I believed would be important for a particular trial, and I'd bring them back to the chief engineer. We were on a first-name basis at this point. I'd trot over to his cube, and I'd say, Dwight, it needs to do this, this, and this. And he'd go, it doesn't do that. And I'd say, but it needs to. And he'd go, it doesn't do that. And he'd walk away. And then he'd come back a half an hour later, and he goes, what if it does this, this, and this? And I'd go, that works. And we go from there. So we grew the product, we grew the services, and to give you an idea of the kinds of things, technology is a magic bullet, but it only works if you really understand what it can solve. One of the problems that happens in pain trials is particularly difficult. In a traditional trial for pain, as you probably know, people have to be in two groups. One group gets their standard of care, one group gets the standard of care plus. You can't tell somebody that they're in a pain trial that you can't use any of your regular pain meds. You can tell them, and they do, this is the med that we're trying out, we're testing. We want you to use this first. If it doesn't work, you can use all your regular ones, but keep good track so we understand. Because some people are getting a real compound, some people are getting a placebo, and nobody knows which is which. So what you need in a pain trial is a full listing of all the meds that these people are using, which can be everything from Advil through the heavy-duty narcotics. And you need it in a way that you can translate it. So you can say, this person took 12 Advils and this many Percocets and this much of this. You translate that into what's called morphine equivalents. So the morphine equivalent for Advil is Zip. But for Percocet, that's different from Demerol, that's different, and I'm talking old names, but there are different levels of strength. So what happens in clinical trials is somebody sits down with the paper diary and the patient's entry of all the meds they took that day, and they do the math. in a spreadsheet to translate it to create morphine equivalents. Oh my God. Talk about error prone. Talk about a waste of some talented person's time. Talk about slowing down clinical trials. So I said, what if we do this? What if we build it into the application so what the patient says is, I took 3 Percocet, I took 2 of this, I took this, and the math runs. Okay. So the morphine equivalents were coming right from our database. They got the raw data, but they also had the morphine equivalent. That's a simple technology, carve. It's an algorithm. It's easy. That's easy. We just had to do it. It was one of the most important things we did, and I was really, really happy to be part of it because it really made a difference for all the people running the trials, as well as capturing the differences between the people who got the pain medication and those who did not in a meaningful way. So that's the kind of stuff that we kind of created to do in the time that I was a PhD, and that was a blast. Not doing real research, but doing a lot of applied work to try to make sure that people had a systematic way to find value. Again, it goes down to patients. I got involved at PhD in the 12 years I was there with a lot of conversations going on.
Sorry, I'm sorry.
That's all right. Did you have a question?
No, I apologize.
Okay. It's all right, not a problem. We had some interesting issues going on at the FDA at the time, and this was my introduction to all the regulatory environment, again, a very corporate issue. It's a fascinating thing to look how the FDA works and how it does what it does to try to manage clinical trials. And again, I can't defend it. It's a very cumbersome system. But the same Steve that hired me and was, kind of an interesting character, he was my entry into really understanding all of the regulatory systems because he worked closely with the FDA and allowed me to be close to as well. So as we began to understand how the FDA thought about things like capturing electronic diaries for patients and the larger scheme of where that fits in clinical trials, we were able to start to have conversations with the FDA that informed my thinking and helped me understand what they meant by patient-reported outcomes, which is an interesting phrase. Are you familiar with that conversation?
The PROs, no.
Yeah. Well, the FDA had a woman by the name of Lori Burke sitting there, a non-metrics person. She wasn't a psychoanalyst. She was not a psychometrician. She was not trained in instrument development. She brought people around her that understood paper questionnaires, but she was frustrated. She goes, what is it, a HRQOL, or is it a PRO, or is it what's the name of this questionnaire? What do you call this questionnaire? Is it, what are these, all these acronyms? She goes, look, done, no more. If it comes out of the patient's mouth, it's PRO, patient-reported outcome. And that's how that whole conversation started. Lori Burke said, we're not going to use all these acronyms anymore to talk about different questionnaires, patient diaries, health-related quality of life, all of that. Just call them PROs. Well, that's grown. First it was just patient-reported outcomes, and then there were clinician-reported outcomes, and there was another way, but the whole point was the FDA was trying to find a way to talk about this with other people, a common language. And once I set up that common language, then all of a sudden I could start, when I got restless at PhD, the searching monster again. And it took me a couple of years, but PRO was the hook. And I found a spot at Merck. And Merck was interested within their informatics team. I don't know why it was there, but the informatics team was responsible for managing a business relationship with a company called Patients Like Me. Patients Like Me is a social media site for people with specific diseases. And if you're familiar with Patients Like Me, they've been trying to figure out a way to monetize their business. And that's a common theme when you get into this kind of world is people need to figure out how to monetize their business. That didn't affect me so much. I was simply managing a relationship that was already put in place, and I was working with informaticists who were largely geneticists and biologists. They didn't have a clue what to do with patients like me. So that was another opportunity to say, okay, I do understand this, but I don't understand your world. I still don't understand high-throughput gene analysis. I'm trying, but I still don't get it. But, managing the Patients Like Me relationship was my entry into the world of big pharma. When that relationship ended and we finished our contract with them, I was a little bit out of the loop. And what you'll find, or what I've found so far in big pharma, is if you make yourself available, they like to recycle people. Getting in there once, you get recycled again and again and again. And that's sometimes fun because it means you can reinvent yourself and go lateral, go forward, go back. You don't have to stay in the place where you started. Biostats people don't stay in biostats the whole time. They often move into roles where they're doing management of programs of research. because by then they get the protocols inside and out, and they're ready now to think about how do we make this as efficient as possible. They understand all the steps. So I was moved a little laterally. I didn't move out of my group, but they had an internal search engine that they built with the help of a consultant. The developers built it. It was intended to help the preclinical scientists find data on compounds that have been shelved, because Pharma does that. There were over 60,000 trials that Merck had somewhere information about, and many of those compounds had never gone forward because either they weren't safe, and we aren't interested in those, but there were ones that didn't work for what they were intended to do. So the scientists wanted to find those old lab records, those old assays, the reports, which were often PowerPoints dumped in a shared file somewhere, and they wanted to understand what had already been done with those compounds, because it's possible they could repurpose them. And they really wanted to do that. So you know the story of Viagra, you know the story of Rogaine, all of those were repurposed compounds that were safe and did something very different from what they were supposed to do. Most pharmas are trying to figure out how to repurpose all those compounds they held on the shelf. So this search engine was designed to do that, and the developers that developed it did a pretty good job of putting it together, but it never met the need of clinicians because they didn't really know how to talk to the clinicians. So I would go with my developer colleagues and say, I need you to come with me because you really understand where this system is at this point. I don't. But I can hear what the scientists want. So let's go together and talk to the internal scientists at Merck about what they need this system to do that's not doing now, because they're not happy with it. And you can tell me how we get there. And my developer colleagues, whom I dearly love, would stand there and say, am I going to embarrass you? I love them for that. So the incidental learning there was, one more time, that common language, that shared communication is absolutely, but you bring something different than they have. And because I understood the scientists well enough to have a conversation with them, and the developers understood their role, that partnership worked very well. We ended up, by the time I left Merck after 3.5 years, that was my favorite experience there. That was tremendously satisfying. I got restless at Merck in part because Merck is so big you can't really have an impact. And that particular project was going to move to our colleagues in Croatia, so I wasn't going to be able to continue to work on it. So I was like, okay, I'm out of here. I want to find something, the adventure board, try something different. This time I didn't go to Monster. This time I had a connection. I knew a woman at Merck that was there, and we overlapped about a month before she moved to Vertex. So I reached out to her on LinkedIn, and I said, is there anything interesting going on over there? Well, she had a non-compete in place, so she couldn't tell me anything much. What she could say was, go there. Kind of go there. So she made sure that she didn't violate the non-compete. But it allowed me to have an entry. And what she did was make sure that I found the right people to talk to. This is another reinvention because I'm still in IT, which is different for me. I was in informatics before within IT, but informatics feels a little more sciencey than IT does. I work with a group of 6 people who, with their colleagues, are responsible for keeping the lights on for a lot of the systems for the clinical area. And my role is totally different. My role is more as a product owner, more the kind of person who understands what the clinicians are trying to figure out and is out there to help translate that for the developer. Same as a PhD, same as at Merck. That product owner role is a blast for nurses because you have so much skill. And the interesting thing about this role now was I've been there for 2 days with this kind of global intent for me to be involved with patient-reported outcome measurement, with the use of different kinds of devices for clinical trials. What can we do with electronics to make data collection better? But can we use phones to give us more information about location and passive data collection through people's phones that's useful for a trial? That's kind of the dream, but we're not there yet. But 3 days after I got there, the woman that I admire so much, who's the VP for ClinOps, sent my boss a note and said, guess what? Our sites are having a problem with our trials. This is CF. This is a rare disease. We don't have that many sites that we work with, but we work with about all of them. So those sites are having a problem with how we manage our trials, and we're throwing a lot of new clinical trials at them all at once. So they're, instead of managing 1 or 2 of our troublesome trials, now they're managing up to 11 at a time. How do we do this and make it easier for them so they're happy with us? Because we don't want to lose these sites. So there's that corporate America theme. the thing that's really useful to me is that I've always felt like staff nurses at sites are underserved by all of us, and within clinical trials they work super, super hard, but they get splat. Where it's really, really hard for the nurse researchers who are at clinical sites to do their work. And so for me, this kind of is an opportunity to do something for people who I feel is their home, their friends, their colleagues. So we're in the process of building that. And the role is something I'm defining again, because when I got there, people really hadn't talked about what's called the agile methodology of software development, which is the old, this is newest catchphrase. And one of the things about this methodology has to do with turning around work quickly and doing work efficiently instead of doing a long, slow process. But the beginning of it is that conversation with end users. The beginning of it is the conversation to say, so what would you like a system to do and why? And here's the sentence I want you to finish. As a blah, 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 I want to blah, 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 so that blah, blah, blah. You build a group of those user stories. It's super easy to get. I ended up with 80 after an hour and a half with a handful of people, bigger handful than I wanted, but a lot of user stories that begin to tell you where you need to go with software development. And that's the beginning of that iterative process with Agile. So once I've got the user stories, we start looking at them and trying to see common themes. This is research. Trying to figure out ways that you can marry up these issues so that they're useful for people. Work with the same people again and again, and maybe some more, to ensure that you're on the right track. Start developing images of what you can do. That's when the developers get involved. You run those past people. All the time, it's this back and forth between yourself and the developers and the users, which is really fascinating. I love it. It's a blast. And I think the reason it works for me is that I think that there's value in what it does. It's back to nursing in a way. I'm doing something good for people that I really want to help, and ultimately it helps patients. The other piece that I think is really important for me and that I never lose is this challenge and fun of figuring out how to talk to people that are different from me. And I've learned to enjoy that. It terrified me in the beginning. And I've learned that it really doesn't matter if you feel like, the world is over. These are just details on those trials, Ronnie, and I've talked way too much.
It's not a problem. No, that's great.
Way too much.
No, that's great.
But it really doesn't matter whether or not you feel terrified because nobody knows it. It's like, you feel like you're a fraud, but nobody notices. And it happens every time. So when I started a line of accomplishments against traditional against non-traditional, the traditional ones, the publications of children's, some teaching, undergraduate mostly, some graduate course work, but very little. And then the non-traditional accomplishments kind of lent themselves well. There are still some original publications coming out, but they're original technologies more than research per se. And I consider the kind of research, when you're thinking about representing findings from user stories truthfully and honestly, not twisting it so that it meets your needs, having a little bit of rigor. So, lots of roles. I think overall you need to think about the fact that the titles don't much matter by the time you get this far along in your career. They really don't. If titles are driving you, you might want to look at the path you're choosing to make sure that that's consistent with that path. As I am now a principal analyst. What does that mean? Who knows?
You're a principal eClinical analyst.
Oh, well, yeah, but still.
I'm just wondering, I want you to address how you can make any sense out of the titles that you do read. And can you?
I don't even care about them. So I'm not a good person to answer that. I only have 2 to speak to. Well, 3, PhD, for profit settings, they create the titles as they go. So PhD kept creating titles, and I go in every couple of years and say, okay, I need a new title because I've been here, my resume should show change. We would figure out a name. Merck and Vertex have some titles, but the titles don't much matter except to your manager. There they matter because they put you in a place where they can defend you and get an adequate salary. So Vertex created a job description for me and a title for me that was consistent with the Vertex set of titles, which is fine with me. All I cared about was that I would have some autonomy and I'd be paid well. But, I was really very, very interested in having some autonomy. I do not have a management role, and so I don't have a director title. But other than, management versus individual contributor, it's hard to tell from the titles what matters. Isn't that funny?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Again, it's alphabet soup. It's the ultimate alphabet soup,
Exactly.
and you look at inside those, and it's hard to know even where to target a conversation of whether or not you're in the same ball field, much less, when you're trying to find someone who does certain things. Even in the nursing informatics and electronic health records world, it's hard to tell who's the clinical analyst, who's the program developers, you can start to make some sense out of it, but it's when we teach the informatics course, it's tough to see a good place in somebody with a person that's similar to what you would hope they would be able to do.
I think the big split really is management versus non. So that director piece, if that's what you want the students to learn, that's the experience. But the analysts are the people that do the work.
We just recently had a conversation with one of the large hospital systems, and the question was the conversation was with the corporate office. It really was the C-suite. And that's what they thought our students would want to be able to observe and watch and go to meetings with them. And that isn't what you want for students. You want them to get in there, roll up their sleeves, and do a little more than that. And to communicate that, they're very proud of. We give them this great experience because they could follow the head of blah blah blah. And I think we said kindly, but that's not exactly so.
Yeah. But both Merck and Vertex have internships that are designed as a partial recruitment tool. A freebie test, or low-paying test of students and fellowships and internships. That's more where I would aim these people. So they have that opportunity to be at a place for 10 weeks with a relatively defined role, but you have opportunities to influence those roles as well. And of course, people like me. I'm happy to help you out.
Good. I'm working on it.
So what do you folks think?
I'm looking at that bullet there. Looking at the fact that you have a PhD, and you said deciding that I prefer applying knowledge to creating it was a watershed moment. Could you talk a little bit about that?
I really tried after my doctoral program to find an enthusiasm for research. And even while I was enthusiastic about helping the staff nurses figure out questions and answers to those questions, I never took it as far as a Martha Curley. Is Martha still out there doing cool stuff in peds? She had a passion for that next question and that next question and that next question. And I'd much rather sit and talk to the kids in the hallway waiting for their surgery. And it's still that way.
Know thyself.
Yeah.
Know thyself.
Yeah, I'd much rather talk to the developers and help them understand what the clinical trial issues are, and try to be that link. That's just more me. I don't think I have the passion for it, and I don't think you can build it. It's either there or it's not. Where do you want to be?
That's a good point. That's a good point.
Well, I really have to, I'm taken back by it because, you get that PhD and the expectation is that you are going to create knowledge and move it along.
It's tough.
And, to make that decision, I think it's really like, wow.
Of course, the reality of our jobs, too, is, yes, you're going to do that and carry 9 credits and teach and all the other things because it's an aside in nursing. We don't have there are places that have a culture of producing 100% scientists, and that's what they do. Typically, that's not where the monetary jobs are.
Right.
So.
Yeah, and that's the position that I find myself, because I take on more things, but I never let anything else.
Mm-hmm.
I never let anything go. I'm still working staff in the NICU as a per diem staff nurse, because,
You love it.
I can't, yes. No, yes.
You have to.
I'm not so crazy about 12-hour shifts and working the weekend, and I have to work this weekend, but that's one of my issues. I have been interested in research. I got my doctorate later for a lot of different reasons, and, I absolutely love the research. I'm trying to do this, and I also teach, full credit load and then some, and I still work as a lactation consultant. I still work for diem in the NICU. I haven't let anything go, and I'm trying to still do, and I have several research projects that finally finished some of them. Some of them I'm trying to finish up. I can't get a hand. Some of it is I can't let it go, and I don't know how to do that.
I
don't know, I can't, but you can't really fully move forward if you don't
Well, something's holding me back. I mean, I'm not enough of a therapist, but and it may just be the fear of the unknown. It's not atypical for us to be afraid to take that step and to be found out to be a fraud or take that risk. I've got a job. I can't tell you the number of people. I'm 66. I took my last new job at my most recent new job at 66. It may not be my last, but I did burn my resume after work. I had to recreate it because I hadn't used it. I didn't think I'd ever need another job. But don't ever throw your resume out. It's really hard to recreate it. But I think that there is that inherent fear. There's a little bit of adventuresome there for me. For me, it's the satisfaction of having actually jumped and landed. There's a little bit of passion for that craziness in me. That's why I went to Seattle all by myself with a 3-year-old.
That's right.
And that's why I do the things I do. So I get bored. I need to have that little bit of challenge and risk-taking.
But I wonder if that difficulty, that challenge of letting go is perhaps because that piece that you're going to let go, that piece is really part of defining who you are.
Right.
That's a good point.
So,
Yeah. I mean, because I'm a little, I'm not so much of a risk taker, but I get very bored. That much I can tell you. But I some of the way I've coped with it is because I do several different things.
Yeah.
But that's, I think, a lot of my issue is I keep saying, do I really need to do this work? And then I get there, because I'm like that today because I'm working the weekend. So, so I'm really I'm really thinking about it. But then once I get there, I'm
you're
like,
fine.
yes, I do need to
You
be
become you. Oh, okay.
because I still feel like that I have something to contribute there.
I remember thinking about that with the first few reinventions, even going to my master's program. What am I closing myself off from? What am I losing? And what is it? How many doors does it open for me? And the delta was big enough that, I took that first step. After that, it was more a matter of, I didn't question the fact that these things would open the doors for me.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that the doors have become less and less obvious. So when you get to the point of reinventing yourself, you're kind of creating the door.
Mm-hmm.
You're making the role. You're figuring out what it is that is an interesting next thing to do. But you're right. There's a piece there that I've lost. I couldn't be credible anymore as a staff nurse. Do I love that? Maybe don't love it as much as you do, but I loved it for pieces of it, for sure.
I tried keeping it for a long time. I kept trying to define myself to others, and I am a clinician. I kept trying to do that. And then the reality of being able to legitimately give it the time and find a paying enough job that would allow you to do that. That's why I said I wanted, the dream job was to work in the children's hospital, have one foot all the time there and the other foot in an academic place where you're supposed to be generating researchable questions. That to me I thought would be the dream job. And as I said, many people that I knew who had that job said you were 100% in both of them. You had to clearly put some boundaries around, or you couldn't be successful in either. And I think we all look for something that makes us feel worthwhile. I mean, we really want something that gives us meaning. And I know all of my doctoral students have always said, I want to ask a question that's important and that will make some meaningful contribution. And my note to them is, first you get done. Maybe a good question. First you get done, and then when you're able to do those other things that don't have the timetable that you really have to keep in the front of your mind to be finished. But we all want to have a good sense of self, and I never realized how alike we are. That must have been why Penn State was kind of the early day of connecting. But the getting bored, I think smart people are not comfortable with status quo. I think they're always looking for something else to make the juices flow, and that's why we live our days in the university setting, because we're with smart people all the time. And I think that's a good thing. So that's why I've been happy in academia. And I play around with the idea of could I live in a corporate world, and I don't know that I could. Smart people, I mean, you at least were with smart people, right? A lot of very smart people.
You can define smart a lot of ways.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't have a problem with it. Most people don't even know I have a PhD. I talked to somebody yesterday, and he's a pal, and at Vertex, and So I was going to come down and talk to some graduate students in nursing, and that I just don't really feel credible as a role model. I've been around a long time. And he goes, yeah, and you don't even have a PhD, do you? And I said, sit down, Michael. It doesn't matter. That's the title again. It isn't the title that matters. It's how you use it. Because I would argue again that taking user stories and creating requirements that are bound in fact in those user stories is a research science. It is a science to go from those user stories to requirements. You can't do it credibly unless you're respectful of all the things that make good data collection work. But it's a little slipperier, it's a little softer. There's no SaaS program that does it for you, and there's no, but it's still research. I don't know. I just, you never stop being a nurse. You never stop thinking like a nurse in some ways. I haven't defined that core set of nursing things that you never let go of. Part of it's our own pathology, and if I could, we never stop. We keep doing things that other people could do because we think we have to fill those holes. The other pathologies, we tend to think we have to do it ourselves. Is that still true? Oh my God, so wrong. So wrong. So I mean, that's part, I don't know whether it's our gender, I don't know where it comes from, but those are things I fight because it does not work. It's worked every time for me to be able to find somebody who has a skill set I don't have and for me to say, I don't know what you know, but boy, we can kick ass together. And we do. We really make a difference together. And it's, the more different they are from me, the better we do. So.
Listening to your talk and other people's comment, something I haven't talked about and afraid to talk about is it's about the roots, because I had I would say sociologist first. Then I went to nursing school to get my BSN degree and then FMPH. Sometimes it's afraid because most of you guys, you have your roots in nursing. So I feel like my roots is not that.
Oh, we won't. Barb and I met. I left. I was a master's prepared teacher at Penn State, and then got my PhD in human development and family studies. And my world was interdisciplinary. And everything. And I think when we were speaking before, I mean, she's comfortable with engineers and developers. The one thing that I think we believe is that those nurses who do nurse talk, it's all because they're nurses, but we all have backgrounds and certainly interests that are other disciplines. And as soon as, talk to you about that, bring your expertise. And that sociology, that ability to, one of the things that Aaliyah had worked on was voting. I mean, her dissertation was voting preferences among Asian people, and that kind of skill set. And we threw in some health questions. We played around with secondary analysis. That's when I think it's really exciting when you can have a completely different perspective on a question. I think that's what makes the best questions. So, but that's, and I think it's pretty common here. I mean, you're at your PhD program. You got to meet other people, didn't you?
Oh, yeah, I met all of them.
Yeah, I don't think that's uncommon. All my work with the lactation consultants, because many of the lactation consultants are nurses, but many of them are not. Some of them have a nutrition background, some of them have a sociology background, biology background.
I think when you look at how people mark their credentials, it helps you understand what they feel is strongest. I still call myself nurse first, but these credentials aren't my business card at all. But the PhD taught me a way to think. But the core of me is with the discipline of, reaching out to patients and helping people get better. Your core is different. It's fine for you to do that. But that means you do bring something really useful.
I'm still very inspired and admire those nurses been working there, doing it or being a clinician for many, many years and still very passionate about their job. Because after my 5 years in intensive care unit, that's I can't do it anymore. But back to your talk, I feel like listening to see how you transition from one job to another, I think there's a common thing there is you really work as a person to bring the bridge of, always two different things. You bring them together, so you're able to communicate, you're able to understand and put, two different words, combine them together and make them work something, come up with something very, contribute to whatever the area. That's a lot like nurse. What we to
I think so.
bridge between patient and doctors, between the patient and families, and things like that. So that's.
You've got to find some satisfaction in that to do this kind of work.
And I have another comment or question. How involved you are in social media?
Personally or
Personally.
professionally?
Personally.
I just went over my data limit again because of Facebook, but that helps you. I don't do Twitter. I do a certain amount because it's a communication channel with kids and my family. I'm comfortable there. I choose
So
not
it's
to be
a
more involved.
personal one.
Right.
Because the social media, social networks just so exploded into every single aspect of your life. Now I guess the first day of school this week, and my children's elementary school asked us to have a Twitter account so we can see our kids' picture every day. It's just everywhere you cannot stay away from, I feel like. And on the other hand,
That's a sociologist to me. Why are you interested in that?
Yeah.
Tell me more, because I'm curious.
Your
now.
ID, that's
totally
it.
perpetuates, yeah. And that seemed like the new way of connecting people, and that breaks down a lot of boundaries that we had before.
But creates others. If that's the only way you communicate, right? You
And,
forget how to talk to people face to face without even on a phone or in a letter.
So the boundaries being, reset or redefined right now. And on the other hand, it seems like the protection of patient privacy, confidentiality, never ever like so
Yeah, it's opening all kinds of stuff.
so emphasized nowadays. I feel like sometimes, for instance, the patients, bring bring students to clinical sites and tell them you cannot talk about anything whatsoever happen in a clinical setting, or even for our work, like I'm also a nurse practitioner, so I go to visit patients in their home, and it seems like I'm forbidden to say anything about my visit. Then to some extent, I feel that prevents knowledge sharing a lot of times. And
It's a good question.
from your perspective, corporate, or how you guys handle that situation, knowledge you have any?
Here's a story from Patients Like Me, which I think is fascinating. Are you familiar with that? Patients Like Me, all one word. Go online, look them up. They started with two brothers who had a third brother who had, was it Huntington's? Or ALS? ALS.
Oh, yeah.
And, as he progressed in his ALS, the family became more and more aware there was no way for ALS patients to find each other for moral support, for communication, for what's the best research. After his death at mid-30s, brothers developed this website called Patients Like Me, and it was largely from their outreach to the ALS community that website started, and it was intended to be a place where whatever disease you have, you can go and find other people with that disease and communicate. So Patients Like Me started to grow exponentially. They tried to figure out a way to monetize their work. They began to look at what people were actually saying online, and with the appropriate controls, so they weren't identifying individuals, but they started to realize that there were patients on there with different disease states now. And I think it was the people with chronic fatigue syndrome or one of those types of diseases who were starting to talk about a clinical trial they were in. These are rare enough diseases they could figure out they were all in the same trial. And they were doing things like AIDS patients did in San Francisco way back when. I think I'm on the med. I don't think I'm on the med. Do you know the story about San Francisco about where the guys were sharing, opening the pill caps,
Contamination.
stirring it up, refilling pills, so everybody got some? That community is unique in that respect. But these people were talking about their experience in this trial, and it raised all those issues. Should they be able to talk about this? What do we do about it in a social media setting, because this isn't the only place where people talk about this? Is it really a breach of confidentiality in the trial? This is a little off of where you're going, but it's an example of how people are struggling with this and trying to understand it. And the voice of reason tells you that just because we've created a vehicle where they can talk to each other more rapidly doesn't mean we've created a new thing for them to talk about. Anybody that's been in a clinical site knows that on the MS study day, You got a room full of MS patients out there, and they're
They're
talking to
sharing.
each other. I'm sure I'm on the med. I don't think I am. Even the docs and nurses do it. I think this guy's on it because of the improvement. Now, it is not. It doesn't unblind study. It happens. But understanding how we do it with social media is not completely figured out yet. The other side of that I see a lot of is this great desire to use these large data sets for something meaningful. One of the studies we did recently was for that purpose, to try and look at large data sets and figure out whether there's anything useful in there with all that noise and all that potential for error. And just because it's big doesn't mean it's clean. So what do we do with it? And the only thing I've seen so far that there's endless interest, but the only thing I've seen so far that I feel confident is probably a worth acting on piece of information are the Twitter feeds that start to report the outbreaks of influenza around the world. And you can actually see it from an epidemiological perspective. Oh yeah, it started there and now it's here and now it's going there. And
You can geographically map those tweets.
But people are trying very hard to use those big data. And most of this Twitter feeds, what we were looking at was searches on Bing, because we happened to have somebody from Microsoft who wanted to do some research and had access to that huge volume of search data. And we wanted to understand if we could see anything useful. And it's like any other research. You start at the descriptive level and see what you have, and then see whether or not it leads to something more useful. Don't try to do a clinical trial based on this. Figure out if it's useful first. So we did that little kind of dig in the sand, looking at patients who had people who probably had a new diagnosis of type 2 diabetes, meaning that for 6 months at least they had never searched for type 2 diabetes, and now they were doing a lot. So that's a pretty good marker. And then look at what they do with their searches following that and try to relate that to their level of health literacy, for lack of a better term. So we mucked around in a humongous data set with this guy from Microsoft to see if we could figure out anything. Yeah, it was fun. It was interesting, but it was descriptive. I don't think we found anything fascinating, but we threw it out there to begin, get people to think about that as another large data set. Can we find anything useful? So what do we do with this data is probably more a question than how private it is.
I'll invite you. I've sent it around, and I probably will talk about it at the faculty meeting on Wednesday, to the new FIRE group, which is Forum on Intercollegiate Regional Events in PhD Nursing. We made it up. That was a great acronym.
That's a good acronym.
Yeah, it was great. Eight of the metropolitan area PhD program directors of the PhD programs got together a couple of times, little wine and cheese. We ought to find a way to bring our students together. That event is at the New York Academy of Medicine on the 19th, and Sue Bakken is one of the speakers. She just saw her talk on using Twitter and social media in developing the potential researchable questions, and she's not a sociologist. I mean, she's not a sociologist, but getting a sociologist involved with that sort of thing would be very cool. Be really fun.
There's YouTube. There's so many people doing their diary of what they eat.
Be fun. So I'll be sure that you get that flyer and know that you're invited partly to meet Sue Bakken. She's a very big name at Columbia and has been all kinds of awards. But her last talk was, I think she's one of those classic researchers who says, okay, I've done this part, let's see what else we can do. And when the kind of stuff that she's landed grant money for and she's been able to do in that area, I think I hope that our audience will get inspired of, there's other things we could do. We've got to stop apologizing, because descriptive is useful. We cannot apologize that research isn't valuable. It is. You have to ask the so what question, but
we're usually the ones that say, no, you don't start a clinical trial. You start a descriptive.
That's right.
And that's not trivial.
That's right. That's right. Good. That's good. Any other questions? I promised Barbara, she said, do I have to talk for 90 minutes? I said, no, we usually, get to 1:15. I let people that have lives and things to go. Any other last questions or
online, too.
Okay. Anybody out there still in the hinter world? I think I heard a boo-boo.
Yeah, I heard a boo-boo.
I think I heard a boo-boo.
They had to go. Yeah.
Had to go.
Totally.
I think people who are at work, I think that might happen.
Well, they get the lunch hour, and I get a couple of people who click in, and I'm hoping I can find it so I can say how many. I did my estimate at 6. I am pretty good at this. I really am pretty good at this. And I think there are 2 or 3 folks on the outside too. Well, I can't thank Barbara enough. I mean, this was effort.
As you go along, I'm happy to talk to you. If you speak Arabic, you just want to find me.
That's really good. So thanks, guys. Don't forget to grab a cup, those cupcakes and the cookies. How are you?
Yeah, I'm